The cameras flashed like lightning in the grand ballroom. James Caldwell held his glass of whiskey with firm fingers as he watched Olivia from across the room. Dressed in an elegant red silk gown, she was impossible to ignore. But he noticed the small details, the slight tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers clutched the stem of her glass, the quick flutter of her lashes. She was uncomfortable. He crossed the room with slow, deliberate steps, ignoring the polite greetings from guests. When he reached her, he placed a firm hand on the curve of her back. "Are you okay?" he murmured near her ear, his voice low and rough. Olivia swallowed hard before answering without looking at him. Too many people. Too much noise. James sighed. He knew she struggled with crowded events, but he had always thought she would get used to them over time. "Come with me." Without waiting for a response, he led her out onto the private terrace, away from the chaos. The night air was cool against her skin, lifting strands of her dark hair. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, inhaling deeply. James leaned against the railing, watching her in silence. She was beautiful. More than that. Olivia had always been his weakness, but in the past few months something had changed between them. An invisible wall, something he couldn't quite understand, and it was driving him insane. "You don't have to stay. If you want, we can leave." Olivia turned slowly and finally looked at him for the first time that night. Her dark eyes held something he couldn't decipher. "You wouldn't understand." He took a step closer, gently touching her face. Her skin was warm beneath his fingertips. "Make me understand." Olivia hesitated for just a second, and then, without warning, her lips brushed his in a kiss that was soft but tense. James deepened the kiss, wrapping his arms around her, pulling her body flush against his. Her scent was intoxicating, sweet and warm. The kiss turned desperate. His tongue explored hers with restrained hunger, his hands roaming down her spine, memorizing every curve, feeling her rapid breathing against his skin. But suddenly she pulled away. James frowned, his body still thrumming with heat. "Olivia, what's wrong?" Her eyes filled with a quiet sadness before she whispered, "You'll never understand, James." And with those words, she turned and disappeared into the crowd, leaving him standing there with the taste of her still on his lips and a hollow feeling growing in his chest. James Caldwell hated uncertainty. He had built his empire on absolute control, on knowing the outcome of every situation before it even unfolded. But Olivia was a mystery, one he had never been able to fully solve. For days after the event, she had been distant. Her responses were short, her gaze lost in thoughts he couldn't reach. And what frustrated him the most was that she no longer sought him out. That night he came home earlier than usual. The penthouse was dimly lit, bathed in the soft glow of the city lights. Olivia sat in a sleek armchair near the floor-to-ceiling windows, her legs crossed, an envelope clutched in her hands. He didn't speak at first. He simply watched her from the doorway. The air was thick, heavy with something unspoken. "What's going on?" he finally asked, his voice rougher than intended. Olivia lifted her gaze and held his, unwavering. There was something different in her eyes, something he hadn't seen before. "I need to tell you something." She opened the envelope and pulled out a single sheet of paper. Her hand trembled slightly as she extended it toward him. "I did some tests. I've always known there was something different about me. Now, I have an answer." James took the document, his eyes scanning the words, and everything inside him froze. Diagnosis: Autism Spectrum Disorder, ASD. His pulse thundered in his ears. "No, this doesn't make sense." Olivia let out a soft, humorless laugh. "It doesn't? James, this explains everything. It explains why I've always felt out of place, why certain things overwhelm me, why—" "But you're not like that." His voice was sharp, his jaw tightening. Olivia exhaled deeply and placed the paper down on the table, her fingers trailing over its edges. "I've always been like this. I just spent my entire life pretending." James shook his head. "No, that couldn't be right." She stood up, slowly closing the space between them. Her gaze was locked onto his, and he could see the quiet strength in her posture, the vulnerability she was no longer trying to hide. "Do you still want me, James?" she whispered, her voice almost taunting. her lips curving slightly. "Now that you know who I am." His blood ran hot. Olivia was standing so close he could feel the warmth of her body, the scent of her perfume, a blend of jasmine and something sweet, something unmistakably her. She tilted her chin up, closing the distance even more until her breath mingled with his. She was testing him. James's control snapped. He gripped her waist, pulling her against him in a single fluid motion, and then he kissed her. The contact was urgent, raw. His tongue swept into her mouth, tasting, demanding. His fingers slid down her back, pressing her closer, feeling the heat of her body melt into his. But something was wrong. Olivia wasn't responding like before. Her hands were on him, but they weren't pulling him in. She wasn't giving in. And when James opened his eyes, he realized she wasn't lost in him. She was watching him, and he was failing the test. Olivia's lips were still tangled with his when she finally opened her eyes. The kiss had everything it was supposed to have: fire, passion, intensity. But inside her, there was only an emptiness that he didn't seem to notice. James was holding her with the same dominance, the same hunger he always had. His fingers traced her spine with possessive strokes. His body pressed so close she could feel the heat radiating off him. But that wasn't enough. She placed her hands on his chest and pushed. James let out a breath, his eyes dark with confusion and frustration. "What's wrong?" His voice was low, rough, filled with something dangerous. Olivia wrapped her arms around herself, her body still thrumming from the contact, but her mind screaming something else. "I can't do this, James." A cold, humorless laugh left his lips. "What the hell are you talking about?" She looked up, meeting his gaze with a calmness that wasn't real. "I can't keep pretending this works." James clenched his jaw, the muscles in his neck tightening. "Don't tell me this is about that damn diagnosis." Olivia exhaled, her chest rising and falling slowly as she tried to contain the emotion bubbling inside her. "It's not just the diagnosis, it's everything. It's the fact that I spent years molding myself into a version of me that you could accept, but you never even noticed." His fingers curled into fists at his sides, his stance growing rigid. "So what? You're just going to give up?" Olivia let out a bitter laugh. "Give up? I've been breaking myself into pieces trying to fit into a world that wasn't made for me, but you never saw that, did you?" James stepped closer, his presence overwhelming, his breath uneven. "So that's it, you're walking away?" She swallowed hard, forcing the words past her lips. "I want a divorce." The silence that followed was suffocating. James stared at her as if she had just struck him. No, she couldn't be serious. But she was. And when he didn't respond, when he just stood there watching her with those unreadable, storm-filled eyes, she knew there was nothing left to say. She grabbed her bag, walking toward the door without a second glance. But just as she reached the threshold, his voice stopped her. "And what? You think someone else is going to want you? Someone else is going to understand you?" The words cut deep, but Olivia had already bled out long ago. She turned, her face unreadable, and delivered the final blow. "I'd rather be alone than half-loved." And then she left, closing the door behind her, leaving James standing there, drowning in the echoes of his own arrogance. James Caldwell had never lost anything in his life. Not a deal, not control, and certainly not a woman, until Olivia. For months after she left, he told himself it didn't matter, that she was just another part of his life that he had outgrown, a piece of his past that didn't fit into his future. But every night when he closed his eyes, her scent lingered, her voice echoed, her absence burned. And now she was back. James spotted her the moment she entered the gala. Dressed in a sleek black gown that hugged every curve, Olivia moved through the room with effortless confidence. Different, stronger, untouchable. His grip tightened around his glass, his pulse hammering as he watched her. No hesitation, no uncertainty. She wasn't the woman who had walked out of his life shattered. She had rebuilt herself, and she had done it without him. A slow rage burned beneath his skin as his gaze followed her. Then he saw the man at her side. A polished bastard in an expensive suit, leaning in a little too close, his hand pressing lightly against the small of her back. James saw red. Without thinking, without caring, He moved across the room with quiet, deliberate steps, cutting through the crowd like a predator closing in on its prey. When Olivia turned, their eyes met, and James knew. She had been waiting for this moment. She smiled, slow and knowing, lifting her champagne glass in acknowledgement. James. Her voice slid over him like silk, but he caught the challenge beneath it. He stepped closer, ignoring the other man completely. His entire focus narrowed to her. Olivia. She tilted her head, watching him with those dark eyes that once belonged to him, now unreadable. What a surprise, James smirked, his voice dropping to a low, smooth drawl. Is it? Her lips curved, but he saw the way her breath hitched. He saw the way her fingers curled ever so slightly against the stem of her glass. She wasn't as unaffected as she pretended to be. Good. James leaned in, his lips just inches from her ear, his breath warm against her skin. You didn't think I'd let you walk back into my world without consequences, did you? She turned slowly, her mouth barely brushing against his in the movement. It wasn't a kiss, but it was a threat. You don't control me anymore, James. He chuckled darkly, his fingers grazing the bare skin of her back, feeling the heat of her body, the undeniable tension crackling between them. Then why are you still reacting to me? Olivia inhaled sharply, her spine stiffening, her control slipping for the briefest second. But then she stepped back, composed, unshaken. Enjoy your night, James. And just like that, she walked away. But James knew. She wasn't running this time. She was challenging him to chase her. And he would. James Caldwell was not a man who let things go. And Olivia was not something he was willing to let go. Since the gala, she had occupied his every thought. The way she looked at him, like he was just another man in the room, no longer someone who could command her attention, it drove him insane. So when he found out she would be attending an exclusive business dinner at a luxury restaurant, he didn't hesitate. He wasn't invited, but James Caldwell never needed an invitation. Olivia was seated at the center of the private dining room, surrounded by New York's elite. She was speaking, her voice poised, her smile practiced, her presence commanding. James leaned against the doorway, watching her. She was different, more confident, more in control, more irresistible. And yet, when their eyes met across the room, her fingers tightened ever so slightly around the stem of her glass. She still felt him. That was all the confirmation he needed. He strode toward her, the low hum of conversation fading as people turned to acknowledge his presence. Olivia's lips parted slightly, a flicker of surprise flashing in her eyes before she masked it with indifference. James, she said, her voice smooth, unbothered. He smirked, taking the empty seat beside her, ignoring the man who had been leaning too close just moments ago. Olivia, she sipped her wine, her lips brushing the rim of the glass in a slow, torturous movement. Didn't expect to see you here. James leaned in, his voice a low murmur meant only for her. Didn't you? She inhaled softly, but her expression didn't break. What do you want? James tilted his head slightly, his gaze dropping to her lips, then back to her eyes. You. A flicker of something dark crossed her expression before she let out a soft laugh. You always did mistake possession for love. James chuckled, his fingers trailing along the edge of the table, close enough to her hand that she would feel his presence without him touching her. Yet. And you always did mistake fear for freedom. Her breath caught, barely perceptible, but he noticed. The game had begun. Later that night, he cornered her in the dimly lit hallway outside the restaurant's lounge. She turned to face him, her chin lifted, her eyes blazing with defiance. I'm not the same woman you walked away from, James. He moved closer, close enough that their bodies nearly touched, close enough to feel the warmth radiating off her skin. Good. His voice was low, dark, dangerous. Because I'm not the same man. Her breath came out uneven, her pupils dilating as he raised a hand, his fingers barely brushing against her exposed shoulder. You still react to me, he whispered. She swallowed hard, tilting her head slightly as his touch traveled down her arm, slow, deliberate. And you still think you can control me? James smirked, leaning in until his lips hovered just over hers. I don't need to control you, Olivia. I just need you to stop pretending you don't want this. For a moment, just a fleeting second, her eyes softened. Her body leaned in, her lips parting ever so slightly. And then, she did the unexpected. She took a slow, calculated step back. "Not yet," she murmured. James clenched his jaw, his body thrumming with heat, with frustration, with need. Olivia smiled, slow and wicked, before turning and walking away. He had won battles before, but this time she was making him earn it. James Caldwell had spent his life mastering control, in business, in power, in women, but Olivia was chaos. A slow-burning wildfire he couldn't contain, couldn't walk away from. And now, she was playing him at his own game. The next time he saw her, it wasn't by accident. Olivia was attending an exclusive rooftop event in Manhattan, surrounded by glittering lights, expensive champagne, and men who didn't deserve to look at her. James watched her from across the terrace, his grip tightening around his drink. She was breathtaking. A silky midnight blue dress draped over her curves, the slit teasing the length of her thigh with every movement. Her dark hair fell in soft waves down her back, and when she smiled at something another man had said, James felt the burn of possessiveness crawl up his spine. He wasn't a patient man, so he didn't wait. He crossed the space between them with slow, deliberate steps, his presence drawing her attention before he even spoke. Olivia turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "You're following me now?" James smirked, stepping closer. "You knew I'd come." She exhaled softly, but there was something in her eyes, something flickering between restraint and temptation. James reached for her, his fingers barely grazing her wrist before sliding lower, brushing against the inside of her palm, skin on skin. A slow inhale, a sharp exhale. Her pulse thrummed beneath his touch. She still felt him. Olivia swallowed, but didn't pull away. "What are you doing, James?" He took another step, his body nearly touching hers, the heat between them suffocating. "Reminding you." Her lips parted, her breath uneven, her body betraying her even as her mind fought to stay in control. James lowered his head, his lips hovering over the curve of her jaw. Not kissing, just waiting, torturing. She shivered, and when she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "Reminding me of what?" James's fingers traced the length of her arm, feather-light, slow enough to make her tremble. "That you were always mine." Olivia inhaled sharply. Then, in one swift movement, she grabbed the back of his neck and pulled him down into a kiss that shattered every last pretense. Their mouths collided in a clash of heat and hunger, her fingers tangling in his hair as he groaned against her lips. James's hand slid down her back, pressing her against him, feeling the way her body melted into his. The kiss deepened, her tongue meeting his in slow, deliberate strokes, teasing, demanding, owning him. But just as quickly as she had kissed him, she pulled back, breathless, shaken. James barely had time to register the loss before she leaned in, her lips brushing against his ear. "You don't get to control me anymore." Then she stepped away, leaving him standing there with her taste still on his lips, with his body still burning for her, with the undeniable realization that for the first time in his life, he was the one being played. James Caldwell had never felt powerless. But as Olivia walked away, her taste still lingering on his lips, his body thrumming with the ghost of her touch, he knew he was losing control. And worse, he liked it. He didn't chase her that night, because he knew she was waiting for him to. And James never played by someone else's rules. Instead, he let her leave, let her think she had won. But fate had other plans. A week later, he saw her again. Not at a gala, not at some exclusive event, but at the last place he expected, a quiet, dimly lit bar in downtown Manhattan. She was alone. A glass of whiskey sat untouched in front of her, her fingers tracing absent patterns on the rim. James watched her from across the room, taking in the way her shoulders tensed, the slight furrow in her brow. She wasn't playing now, and that made him move. She didn't look up when he slid onto the bar stool beside her, didn't react when he ordered the same drink as her, his voice calm even. But he felt it, the moment she registered his presence. The slow inhale, the stiffness in her spine, the way her body recognized him before she did. "Are you following me again?" Her voice was quiet, but there was no challenge this time. James studied her, the shadows casting soft highlights along her cheekbones, her lips slightly parted, the vulnerability in her expression unguarded. Not this time. She finally turned to face him, her dark eyes locking onto his. For the first time, there was no pretense between them, just history, just silence, just everything they had never said. "Why are you here, James?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached out, his fingers grazing hers where they rested on the bar. A slow touch, a test. She didn't pull away. "Because you don't want to be alone tonight." Her breath caught. She looked down, her fingers tightening around the glass, then back up at him. "And what if I do?" James leaned in, his mouth dangerously close to her ear. "Then tell me to leave." A pause. Her lips parted, but the words never came. Instead, she exhaled slowly, deliberately. And then she closed the distance. Her lips brushed his, featherlight, testing, until testing wasn't enough. James groaned against her mouth, his hand sliding to the back of her neck, tilting her head to deepen the kiss. She tasted like fire, like whiskey, like a mistake he would make 1,000 times over. His fingers slipped down her spine, memorizing the way her body curved against his, the way she shivered when he traced the bare skin at the small of her back. Olivia's nails dug into his shirt, her tongue meeting his in slow, deliberate strokes, teasing him, tempting him. And then, just as suddenly as she had given in, she pulled back. Her breath was uneven, her pupils blown wide. James tightened his grip on her waist, his voice dark, husky. "Don't run this time." She looked at him, really looked at him. Then she stood, and without a word, without a glance back, she walked away, leaving James sitting there, his body still burning, his mind spiraling, because this time he wasn't sure if she would come back. James Caldwell had spent his entire life believing he controlled everything. His business, his power, his emotions. Olivia had shattered that illusion, and now she was slipping through his fingers. The night she walked away, he told himself he wouldn't go after her, that if she wanted to leave, she could. But then why the hell couldn't he breathe? Why was her taste still on his tongue, her scent still in his veins, her absence burning into his skin like a scar? James wasn't the type to chase, but this wasn't just anyone. This was Olivia. 3 days later, he found her. Not because he had planned to, not because he had called or sent a message or played into the game she wanted him to play, but because fate wasn't done with them yet. It was late. A private members-only lounge in Midtown. Dim lights, low music, the scent of bourbon and exclusivity filling the air. And there she was, sitting at a corner table, swirling a glass of red wine between her fingers, lost in thought. She didn't see him right away, but when she did, when her gaze lifted, when their eyes met across the room, something cracked open between them. Her lips parted slightly. A breath hitched. James didn't hesitate. He moved toward her, slow, deliberate, the crowd blurring around him. By the time he reached her, she had already lifted her chin, her expression unreadable. "James." His name on her lips still did something to him. He slid into the seat across from her, leaning back, his gaze dragging over her face, her dress, her bare skin, tempting him in ways that made his pulse hammer. "Olivia." A long pause. She sipped her wine, her fingers elegant around the stem of the glass, her lipstick leaving a perfect imprint on the rim. "What are you doing here?" James smirked. "What do you think?" Her gaze flickered, her body still too controlled, but she was breathing harder. James reached forward, his fingers brushing against hers on the table. A barely there touch, a warning, a promise. She didn't move, didn't pull away. Instead, she exhaled slowly, her lips parting as if to speak. And then, someone else sat beside her. A man, tall, well-dressed. Not him. James's blood turned to ice. The stranger placed a hand on the back of Olivia's chair, leaning in slightly. Too close. James didn't move, didn't blink, but his entire body tensed, his jaw tightening, his hands curling into fists beneath the table. And Olivia, damn her, she saw it. She smirked. She turned toward the man, tilting her head, brushing her fingers down the stem of her glass, as if she wasn't igniting every possessive, dangerous impulse inside James's body. She was testing him. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if he was going to pass the test. James Caldwell had always known jealousy was a weakness. A man like him, powerful, untouchable, didn't need to fight for attention. People revolved around him, not the other way around, but Olivia Hayes. She wasn't just another person. And as he sat there watching some nobody put his hand on the small of her back, watching her smirk like she knew exactly what she was doing to him, something inside him snapped. He didn't speak, didn't move, but the shift in his energy was unmistakable. The air grew thick, heavy. The temperature in the room seemed to drop, and when Olivia finally turned back to face him, he knew she felt it too. Her smirk faltered. James leaned forward, placing both hands flat on the table, his fingers pressing into the polished wood. "Is this the game we're playing now?" His voice was low, calm, too calm. Olivia's fingers tightened slightly around the stem of her glass. "I don't play games, James." Liar. He arched a brow, tilting his head slightly, his eyes dragging over her slowly, deliberately. "Then what is this?" Olivia exhaled, shifting in her seat. She didn't look at the man beside her, didn't move closer to him, but she didn't move away either. And that was enough to set him off. James stood, smooth, controlled, dangerous. Olivia watched him carefully, her body tense, like she wasn't sure what he would do next. Good. She should be unsure, because James wasn't sure either. All he knew was that he was done pretending, done acting like he could walk away from this, from her, unscathed. So he moved, one step, then another, until he was beside her chair looking down at her, daring her to keep up the act. She didn't blink, didn't flinch. But when James reached down, when his fingers grazed her wrist, when he leaned in close enough that she could feel his breath against her skin, her pulse betrayed her. Fast, unsteady, exactly like his. James smirked. "Tell him to leave." Olivia's lips parted slightly, but no words came out. The man beside her shifted, clearing his throat, oblivious to the war happening in front of him. "Olivia." She inhaled sharply. Her eyes locked onto James's. And then she made her choice. She turned toward the other man. Her voice was soft, steady. "You should go." Silence. James watched as the man hesitated, confused, but ultimately nodded, standing and walking away without a word. And then it was just them. Just James and Olivia. Just the fire burning between them, untamed. James reached for her, gripping the back of her chair, his body looming over hers. Olivia looked up at him, her breathing uneven, her pupils blown wide. "You wanted me to react," he murmured. She swallowed, her throat working around the movement. "And you did." James exhaled sharply, a dark chuckle escaping his lips. "You're playing with fire, Olivia." She tilted her chin, her voice barely above a whisper. "And you're the one who taught me how." James snapped. His lips crashed against hers, his hand sliding into her hair, tilting her head back as he kissed her hard. Olivia gasped against his mouth, her fingers fisting the front of his shirt, pulling him closer, as if she needed him as much as he needed her. His other hand slid down, gripping her waist, pressing her body flush against his. The kiss deepened, hot, desperate, raw. But just when James was about to lose himself completely, Olivia pulled away. Breathless, shaken, but still in control. Not here. James clenched his jaw, his hands still gripping her body, his entire being screaming at him to ignore her. But then she did something worse. She reached up, traced his lower lip with her thumb, and smirked. "Come find me when you're ready to burn." Then she turned and walked away. For the last damn time, she wasn't running. She knew he was coming. She walked down the quiet, dimly lit corridor leading to the rooftop of the high-rise lounge, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor, her movements slow, deliberate. James followed, his breath heavy, his heartbeat thundering in his ears. When he reached the terrace, she was standing near the edge, the city lights painting golden streaks over her bare shoulders, her dress hugging every sinful curve of her body. She didn't turn, didn't flinch, just stood there, waiting for him. James took a step closer, then another, until he was right behind her, his chest almost touching her back, his heat surrounding her, his presence impossible to ignore. "Tell me to leave." His voice was low, rough, edged with something raw and unrestrained. Olivia exhaled, slow and shaky. Then she finally turned, and when she did, his world tilted, because there was no defiance in her eyes this time, no armor, no games, just her, just Olivia. She lifted a hand, traced the edge of his jaw with her fingertips. A touch so light it barely existed, yet it unraveled him. "I don't want you to leave." James inhaled sharply, his restraint hanging by a thread. "Then stop pushing me away." Olivia swallowed, her lips parting slightly, her body swaying ever so subtly toward his. "I don't know how." That was all he needed. James reached for her, his hand sliding into her hair, tilting her head back just enough for his mouth to claim hers. The kiss was slow, deep, not rushed, not desperate. Not this time. This time, he was memorizing her. The way her breath caught when his tongue swept against hers, the way her fingers curled around the fabric of his jacket, pulling him closer, the way she melted against him, surrendering completely. James groaned against her lips, his hands skimming down her spine, pressing into the small of her back, molding her body against his. The heat between them was suffocating, intoxicating. Olivia's nails scraped lightly against the nape of his neck, sending a shiver down his spine. She tilted her head, deepening the kiss, taking just as much as he gave. And when she finally pulled away, her breath uneven, her pupils blown wide, James knew. This was no longer a battle. She had already lost. They both had, and neither of them cared. But as he held Olivia against him, her breath uneven, her fingers tangled in his shirt, he knew this wasn't just about desire anymore. This was something deeper, darker, dangerous, and for the first time, she wasn't running. The rooftop air was thick, heavy with heat despite the cold bite of the night. James traced his thumb along her lower lip, watching as her breath hitched, as her lashes fluttered, as her body responded to him like it always had, like it always would. "Tell me what you're thinking," Olivia swallowed, her lips parting slightly, her chest rising and falling in uneven waves. "That I should stop this." James tilted his head, smirking. "And yet, you're still here." Her fingers curled around the lapels of his jacket, gripping tight. "Maybe I want to see if you're worth the risk." James exhaled sharply, his pulse hammering against his ribs. Then he moved, slow, deliberate, unforgiving. His lips brushed the line of her jaw, trailing lower, his tongue tracing fire along the curve of her neck. Olivia gasped, her head tipping back, exposing more of herself to him. A silent surrender. James smirked against her skin, his fingers skimming down her spine, molding her against him as he pressed his body into hers. "Still doubting me, Olivia?" She let out a shaky breath, her nails dragging down his chest. "I don't doubt that you can ruin me." James stilled. His grip on her waist tightened, his heart pounding. Then he leaned in, his lips brushing against her ear, his voice low and dark. "Then let me." A sharp inhale, a hesitation, and then she shattered. Olivia's hands slid into his hair, her lips crashing against his, her body arching into him like she had been starving for this. James groaned into her mouth, deepening the kiss, his tongue sweeping against hers in slow, tantalizing strokes, drawing every last breath from her lungs. His hands explored, memorizing the dips and curves, the way she trembled when he traced the bare skin of her back, the way her thighs clenched when he gripped her hips. Olivia moaned softly, a sound that wrecked him. James pressed her against the cold steel of the rooftop railing, pinning her there, trapping her between him and the city lights below. His lips left hers only to trail down her throat, over her collarbone, his teeth scraping lightly against her pulse. She gasped, her body writhing under his touch, her fingers tightening in his hair. "James!" His name left her lips like a prayer, like a plea. And just when he thought she would let him have all of her, she pulled back, breathless, shaking. James clenched his jaw, his hands still gripping her waist, his body burning. "Don't stop now, Olivia." She exhaled, her gaze locked onto his, filled with something he couldn't quite name. "I'm scared." James's heart slammed against his ribs. Not because she was afraid of him, but because she was afraid of what they could be, of what this could mean, of what it already meant. He reached for her face, cupping her cheek, his thumb tracing slow, soothing circles against her skin. "Then let me show you there's nothing to be afraid of." Olivia inhaled shakily. She looked at him for a long moment. And then, finally, she nodded. James Caldwell had won, or at least he thought he had. Because as Olivia stood in front of him, her body trembling, her lips still swollen from his kiss, he realized this was never about winning. This was about letting go. Letting go of the power struggles. Letting go of the past. Letting go of the idea that either of them could walk away from this unscathed. She didn't move at first, didn't speak, just stood there, caught between desire and fear, between him and the unknown. James reached for her, his fingers grazing her jaw, tilting her chin up. "Look at me." Olivia exhaled slowly, lifting her gaze, and when she did, he saw it. The surrender, the need, the terrifying, undeniable truth. She wanted this. She wanted him. But love had never been kind to her. It had always been messy, unpredictable, a war she never quite knew how to win. James could see the hesitation flickering behind her eyes, the way her pulse thrummed against her throat. So he made the choice for her. He kissed her, soft at first, barely there, a question, not a demand. Olivia inhaled sharply, her body stiffening for just a second, and then she melted. Her fingers tangled in his hair, her body pressing against his, letting herself fall. The kiss deepened, slow and intoxicating, his hands mapping her like she was something fragile, something precious. His mouth moved down the curve of her neck, over her shoulder, his lips tracing devotion into her skin. "I don't want to be afraid," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. James lifted his head, cupping her face between his hands, his thumbs brushing against her cheekbones. "Then don't be." A pause, a hesitation, and then acceptance. Olivia kissed him again, this time with certainty, with recklessness, with everything she had left to give. James groaned against her lips, desperate to consume her, to make her understand that this, whatever this was already too big, too deep, too real to ignore. His hands explored, tracing every curve, every shiver, every unspoken promise between them. Olivia responded in kind, her touch setting him on fire, her sighs breaking him apart piece by piece. The heat between them was unbearable, a slow, torturous burn neither of them wanted to put out. She pulled back just enough to look at him, her breathing uneven, her eyes searching his. "Tell me this isn't just about winning." James held her gaze, his grip tightening on her hips, his control slipping. It never was. Her lips parted slightly, her body relaxing into his. And that was it. That was all he needed. Because for the first time, Olivia wasn't fighting him. For the first time, she was choosing him. James exhaled, pressing his forehead against hers, knowing he would never let her go again. Not now. Not ever. The city stretched out beneath them, a sea of golden lights flickering in the night. The skyline was endless, vast, just like everything they had been through. James Caldwell stood at the edge of the rooftop, his hands resting on the steel railing, the cold metal grounding him as he stared at the woman beside him. Olivia Hayes, his greatest battle, his deepest desire, his only surrender. She was quiet, gazing at the skyline with that unreadable expression he had spent years trying to decipher. But tonight, he didn't have to guess what she was thinking, because for the first time, Olivia wasn't hiding from him. James reached for her, his fingers skimming down her arm, slow and deliberate, like he was memorizing her all over again. She exhaled, closing her eyes for a brief second, leaning into his touch without hesitation. That alone, that simple, quiet moment of trust, was everything. James turned to her, his fingers tilting her chin up, forcing her to meet his gaze. "Are you still afraid?" Olivia searched his face, her dark eyes burning with something too raw, too real to ignore. Then she smiled, soft, certain. "Not anymore." James inhaled, a slow, sharp breath, like he was absorbing the weight of her words, like he was letting them settle deep into his bones. Then, without another thought, he kissed her. Not with desperation, not with hunger, but with certainty, with everything he never had the words to say. Olivia sighed into him, her hands sliding into his hair, pulling him closer, anchoring herself to him as if she had finally stopped running. Because she had. Because this time there was no more war, no more fear, no more doubts. Just them, just love. And for the first time, love was enough. Love isn't always easy. Sometimes it's war. A battle between fear and desire, between holding on and letting go. James and Olivia fought, broke, and lost themselves in the fire, only to find that love was the only thing worth surrendering to. And you? Have you ever loved someone so intensely that walking away felt impossible? Tell us in the comments. We want to hear your story. But don't leave just yet. The next story is even more passionate, even more intense. One choice, one touch, one kiss can change everything. Click on the next video and dive into another romance that will leave you breathless. We'll see you there.